Hello, before I get back into doing more practical videos on this channel, I thought I should do some content on where I think CSS and web design is now. As a starting point, hopefully we all agree that the web is a series of HTML documents and that our job with web design is to make the ones we're responsible for attractive, usable and accessible with CSS and, where needed, JavaScript. We probably will all agree on the importance of CSS, given that it's entirely responsible for web design. Where we are likely to differ is with our perception of it and how best to work with it. And as some might know, I, like many others, got to the point where I concluded that CSS was best dealt with via a third-party framework or platform, in spite of the restrictions, risks and maintenance issues that come with them. And I started to see some of the negative perceptions of CSS that I've listed here. That it's too basic, too complex, too weird and hacky, too hard to learn, too time-consuming, inconsistent across browsers, not a proper programming language, and sluggishly developed. All of which is a bit of a shame, given that CSS was intended to be for us all, not for elite programmers. So who do we blame for this increasing dependency on third parties? Is it the vague specifications that there certainly were in the early days coming from the W3C? Is it the various browser wars that didn't really end until about 2018? Or is it just with us? Is it our understanding of the web and the CSS? I mean, clearly it's bound to be all three. But my take on modern CSS is that it has, in large part, solved the first two of these issues. So I've done my own personal definition of modern CSS. I'll read that out for those who can't see. That it's a constantly improving logical set of programming modules or languages for interoperable browsers that allows HTML content to be displayed beautifully regardless of device or user preference. And with the first half of this definition, I'm really alluding to what has changed over recent years with the W3C and browser vendors working closer together. Well, generally big tech have come together on this and have refactored CSS so it's more logical and that it works consistently across all of the browsers and continues to be improved. The second part of my definition really relates to the understanding of CSS and the web itself. And I think it's in keeping with the original intrinsic or flexible intentions of CSS and the web. But I think it's also the thing that most of us have struggled with over the last 20 plus years. And it's what I'm focusing on in this video. I think it's fair to say that most of us have got into web design guided by things which fundamentally put us at odds with the nature of the web. So traditionally, designers have been encouraged to conceive of their web designs in static graphic programs, something a client can sign off on, and then convert these into HTML and CSS. And that people coming from a computer programming background will expect programming languages to do exactly as they say. But both HTML and CSS were created as declarative languages for the browser, simply because we do not, at least for any great length of time, get to control what the user sees. So now I tend to see modern CSS as a modern set of tools to do intrinsic web design, which itself is an approach which recognizes that the browser acts as an intermediator between what we would like and what the user needs. So largely I see it as a massive reset on the design mistakes of the past. So it leads me to a different conclusion, one that echoes the present advice of CSS working group experts, people like Rachel Andrews, Jen Simmons, Miriam Suzanne, in that it's time to start removing our dependencies on CSS frameworks and builders, simply because if we are going to work in the way the web works and take full advantage of that, it's going to be easier without them. At least if you see yourself as a design creative, that might not be so true if you're an implementer. And this is not the snobbery of CSS experts. So Miriam Suzanne, for example, was the author of the Suzy framework, which was endorsed by Rachel Andrews. She now helps companies to simplify with the native web platform. And Rachel Andrews is someone who can now teach someone to code their own sites in a day. It's the experienced people used to hacking who will struggle understanding kind of new methods of teaching. If you saw my last video, you may have noticed that I'm working on something which I've called the intrinsic framework. I'll cover this another time, but just know that it's more of an anti-framework. I was kind of amused that as standard-based web designers are starting to give up their free frameworks in disconnected parts of the industry, people have started buying them and into methodologies of the past. So I kind of have a sneaking admiration for the marketers who have managed to pull that off, but I'm not personally intending to sell anything in the future. Also, for many, modern CSS is CSS3. This logo is around everywhere. And there's a real problem with that well, it didn't really exist in the first place, but it also dates back to a time when we just got border radius. So rounded corners was the big wow factor. But as I say, it doesn't really exist. It marks the completion of CSS 2.1. But it did turn out to be very good at raising the profile of CSS. So Jen Simmons a few years back proposed that we update on this. And there is a W3C community group exploring it. Certainly on one hand, it would be nice to be able to say CSS 5 plus instead of talk about modern CSS, which is not a very future-proof term. But it's not without its problems also. It's misleading because CSS is modular. These modules have their own levels and browsers are implementing various criteria on an ongoing basis, often monthly. So, you know, it's not ideal in that way. But I think so great is the concern over the slow adoption of modern CSS features that many felt this may be needed. And you would really think that with the growing demands on everyone, we would all be falling over ourselves to implement the latest improved CSS spec. The browser wars are over. We've got the biggest names in web tech coming together and creating a massive pool of talent working towards the future of the web. And whatever we might think of companies like Google and Apple, they've really stepped up when it comes to the amount of content their employers are producing on modern CSS. Aside from Rachel Andrews and Jen Simmons, there are brilliant contributions from people like Bramus Van Dam, Una Kravitz, Adam Argyle. These are just from Google. And there's lots of other people as well coming into the working groups. I was interested in the account someone gave who's coming from the BBC. Anyway, the point is that adoption has been rather strangely sluggish. And there's the usual reasons for this. People are used to what they know. It could be that too much has come too quickly. Certainly, I'm struggling to keep up with what's coming out, that people aren't used to evergreen browsers. We are used to the fact that when something's talked about and it's coming, that it may never come or it will take years, where now it seems to take months. That things are very different with some of the new CSS. But I think the key points are that employers have stopped asking for CSS skills. That probably the main concern, and that more people have just stopped working directly with CSS. And I think this comes down to the last decade. This has been the growth of page builders replacing CSS as a way to get started. And on the more professional side of things, the CSS in JavaScript, the fact that 10 years ago, React came out creating the concept of the full stack developer, and employers are now just asking for JavaScript. So I think every so often it's really important to go right back to the beginning to avoid making the mistakes of solving just the last problem. And that's what a lot of talks have been doing. I'm going to do exactly the same. And I've even stolen Jen Simmons' screenshot from her 2018 talk, Everything We Know About Web Design Just Changed, where she coined the term intrinsic web design to give a label to that period that's on her timeline that follows responsive. She was mainly talking about layout, but as an aside, she did mention the complexities of CSS and JavaScript and how that could be looking to be a mistake similar to Flash. And I think in the 6 years since her talk, this has become more of a reality. I'm going to go over a timeline again, but with a slightly different focus, as page builders don't really get a mention in any of the industry talks that I've seen. So let's start with flow. So in the early 90s, of course, we got HTML, a basic language for information sharing over the internet. And if we take a look at the first website, which is still online afresh, we can see how beautifully this is designed, not aesthetically, of course, but today we are so used to normal flow that it's easy for us to forget the simple genius of these block and inline elements and how inline text breaks by each word and wraps, so it makes it fully accessible to all people, whatever the device they come on. There's no overflow issues, there's no issues for screen readers. And thanks to the growth of the personal computer, assistive technology following that, and then the web, it looked like we were moving towards having the first truly inclusive medium. A few years later, we got CSS to style our HTML elements. And like HTML, this was a simple declarative language designed so that unskilled plebs like me could not mess it up too badly. Unlike the imperative languages such as JavaScript, if the browser doesn't understand our request, it doesn't break, it simply ignores the mistakes and it displays everything that it can. Of course, we live in a capitalist world, so it didn't take too long before the focus would shift a bit away from inclusive information sharing to how we can use this for targeted marketing. So HTML tables designed for tabular data were quickly appropriated to provide more marketable print-like layout. So David Siegel's Creating Killer Websites book from 1996 was hugely popular. And we still see these sites today. I still get clients come in with them. He was aware that he was destroying the semantic web that made it accessible to all. He just didn't really care about that, like many influencers in web design, since he would justify his position on the number of followers that he helped rather than those who might be harmed or excluded from it. I'm sure almost 30 years on, there are a number of his earlier followers who have discovered that ability is not necessarily a permanent thing through our lives. But accessibility wasn't the only issue, as summarized here by Hayden Pickering. As soon as we got CSS, we immediately found a way to mess with the device agnostic nature of the web and create a headache for ourselves for the next 30 years. And also, following our seeming willingness to quickly dispense with the uniquely inclusive aspect of the web, Flash appeared with essentially the offer to buy a different kind of web for them. So they would get rich and we would get all this admittedly cool and flashy animation, but also an opportunity to torment even more people who can't, or it makes them sick to see animation on a screen. But there was some gotchas with this. You needed to bring your own pre-internet audience, as it was largely closed and not very searchable. And you needed to make sure that your users had the right add-on installed because it wouldn't work with regular browsers. And you might also want to make sure that they remove things that might conflict with it, and encourage them to buy better computers as well, so they can see they have the processing power to see your wonderful animations. But other than that, you're pretty good to go. As we know, Apple really killed this off because they stopped supporting Flash in their browser, and it didn't really die until 2020, though. Luckily, though, the good intentions of the W3C were not entirely extinguished by corporate greed and ego in the early days. We got the Web Standards Project and cool demonstrations like CSS-in JS to show us that we can have nice semantic HTML and still style those documents with CSS. And that's pretty much the point I came into web design, although I had played around with Flash and was quickly embarrassed by my first site with a splash page with lots of kangaroos bouncing around, but try not to talk about that. The problem was, as we move on into sort of this next era, we don't really have anything better than normal flow. So being a modern standards-based designer, doing your best in the era of desktop, trying to meet the expectations of clients, which will be based in print, meant hacking layouts with floats or even worse, absolute positioning, and then finding complex ways to patch over that mistake. So CSS got harder, which in turn created a market for CSS frameworks, which really can only ever be a temporary fix. And during this period, most people, I think, knew that we should be going with sort of fluid design in the spirit of the flexible web, but this wasn't really very easy to calculate yourself with all the paddings and margins, and using percentages, you had to do a lot of calculations. So a lot of people then started to move back to fixed widths because it didn't have some of the issues, and it made better designs on the devices that we had of the time. So we started moving again towards fixed until, of course, the smartphone turned up. So Apple iPhone coming out in 2007, and this really took off as we moved into the 2010s. And reminded us again of the folly of trying to design for the popular device size of the day, so the fluid people could jump and say, see, we were always right. Although there was a short-lived solution called adaptive design, where many thought we should be designing specifically for each device. But as Google search said it would favor the one web to have to crawl, then most went with the responsive approach. And although responsive web design, as coined by Ethan Marcotte in 2010, was envisaged as something more fluid and more in line with Jen Simmons' intrinsic web design, the main tool at our disposal was media queries. So, and this is true to the present day, many sites start with this idea of this fixed desktop size, and then we create these different versions to fit the common size of tablet, if anyone is still using those, and mobile. So the demands at this time on web designers got harder. CSS got harder. That's the time when I started getting a little disillusioned with it. But on the bright side, we did get the one-dimensional Flexbox layout model, or just Flexbox, which takes a bunch of items of different sizes and returns the best layout for those items based on the size of the browser has available. So if we exclude normal flow, which we had in the beginning, this is really our first introduction to what we now call intrinsic web design, in the sense that we were letting the browser calculate the best display for the user's device and the settings, rather than us or trying to control this. However, it kind of had a rocky release, and CSS Grid was still some way from completion on this. And when that came out, that changed some things about Flexbox. So most of us missed the general direction the specifications were going on. Most of us just saw Flexbox as a replacement for floats and continued to exert this kind of fixed unit control over it. And it's here really in the first part of the 2000s and 10s, well, that first half of that decade, where we get a whole bunch of things which begin to lead us further away from working directly with the materials of the web and sort of the direction as well of the specifications. And the first of that is, of course, the page builder. It's really thanks to Flexbox that these were able to grow so much, because it allowed this sort of way of people being able to drag things into their rows, and it was flexible enough to be able to do that. And even though there's been plenty of new builders that have come out after CSS Grid, I'm thinking about Gutenberg, the concept of the page builder is still very much rooted in this idea, this one-dimensional setup. But I'm digressing. The really important thing about this was that it allowed newbies and no-code designers to bypass CSS altogether. Now, I was a fan and still am a fan of low-code solutions in the right situation. That's why I jumped onto page builders, because it provided a new way of being able to work with others, clients in this case. And if the inevitable bloat and technical debt that comes with it can be managed, it can be quite a good solution. Also, back in 2014, when I jumped on a page builder, it was difficult to do layout at that particular time. So this was a way of being able to deliver what clients want in a timely fashion. The cost of it was, as I've kind of realized over the last couple of years, is that it led me to being in my own page builder bubble, disconnected from what was emerging in CSS, which is, what I've ended up going to. I think what concerns me most, though, is no code. So low code is a term I think Forrester coined it around that particular time. No code is really just marketing. Now, of course, the people can update their sites with no coding experience. So bloggers have been doing this for a long time. They may need to know a little bit about HTML semantics, such as heading orders and using alt tags. But I think it's entirely different when it comes to designing web pages. You really need to understand how CSS and browsers work. And this is increasingly so as we are looking at 2000 plus viewport sizes. So when page builders market the dream of no code or the idea of making pretty pictures as web design, it's really doing the web a disservice, not just for the users of the web, but also for new people who will learn to train in a way which we're trying to get away from. And I think that is a market which is at its peak right now. And given what I've seen on the sort of high churn rate, it's not really going to be something that will be stable. There's just lots of new people come into this. But I think hopefully there will be people like Rachel Andrews who will show how it's easy to learn with CSS. And it will remove some of this grouping together of all code being difficult. Maybe it was true of CSS. I don't think it's so true. I do think there's a bit of an issue for a lot of low code solutions as well, because they may need to financially exist by jumping a little bit on board with the no code audience as well. Anyway, let me move on to what I think those at the top of the industry are more concerned about, and that is with CSS in JavaScript. And I think with the growth of mobiles, we started to conceive of the web slightly differently as apps rather than styled documents, which they still are, as we did with CSS-in Garden. We started to see these little patterns, how we can make up these patterns into other little blocks and then put together web pages with that. And by 2014, we had Brad Frost's influential Atomic Design book and also Facebook's React. So we could have, as Facebook had, this single page application where the visitor stays on the one page and various components deliver the content. Now, this set off a whole wave of hype, probably investor fueled, about JavaScript being the future of the web, where previously JavaScript, at least for front-end people, was the last option. It's something you went to when you needed something that wasn't in the declarative languages of HTML and CSS. You didn't reach for it first because it was not always available to all users for various different reasons, and then it could break everything. And mostly things that were commonly needed in JavaScript were added to the declarative languages. So for example, at the beginning, it was mostly used for form validation, which moved into HTML5, and then for rollovers, which then went into the hover pseudo class in CSS. And that shift has continued and even speeded up more recently. So soon we might have view transitions across all browsers, which gives a very React app-like experience as you move through the pages. Of course, I think the key driver behind the popularity is what it's selling there. The concept of the full stack developer. It's very financially attractive to the idea that you can get two devs for the price of one. Somebody can do the front and the back end. Now, I'm not going to get into the gender inequalities that this has brought. I'll put some links below. But I think a decade on, we can better see that in practice, front-end skills were being replaced with dependencies on libraries, which only needed more staff to keep maintaining and updating or replacing. The quality of front-end output can quickly get compromised if all the employers are asking for JavaScript. So that's all they're going to learn. Some are going to scrimp on learning basic HTML and probably will find it very difficult to also keep up on the changes in CSS. So now that things are shifting a little bit back again, we're starting to see some more honest accounts. People have been brave to put them out on the costly project disasters as management have been unable to U-turn on their blind commitment to a JavaScript first approach. We might see the same thing happening with an overuse of AI, but I think there's earlier cynicism on that. I'll put a link to a 4-page article called The Reckoning by Alex Russell on how a JavaScript first front-end culture broke US public services. And also for fun, I'll put in a link to Hayden Pickering's latest video on React. It's brutal and funny, but it does explain how it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't need to because it's more of a faith-based cult. I'm not, though, in that saying that React and similar are not useful in the right context. There's obviously some really clever people doing stuff that they wouldn't be able to do without, and that's perfectly fine. So I'm not putting it down if it's used in the right context. But also, I think we are at the point as well where, as Jeremy Keith has pointed out, that we have to consider things like React as legacy tech now, that we have web components and perhaps even more of a threat, WebAssembly, which is a newer, more powerful programming tool, which is part of the native web. So we might not necessarily need to look to big commercial corporations for our solutions on this. I wouldn't go as far as Douglas Crockford, the inventor of JSON and a 20-year advocate of JavaScript, in saying that we need to entirely move away from JavaScript. On the programming side of things, I'm sure WebAssembly will be the way that most will end up going. But for the foreseeable future, I think it's an important part of front-end work because it helps to push certain things forward and solve situations for us. I think the real problem is this over promotion over the last decade of JavaScript being everything, which has meant that the essential skill of CSS has been lost in this, leading us to have this rather nonsensical situation where we're inventing CSS 4, 5, and 6 to counter that. Personally, I'm not sure if it's needed because, you know, it might take a decade, but usually people end up working out what was hype for short-term profit and what was genuinely useful. In terms of skills, though, for web design, there's a great talk by Jeremy Keith. He always does a good talk where he highlights the difference between imperative and declarative programmers by comparing them to musicians. So, of course, both are needed on the web, but it's also hard to be good at both. So imperative programmers, in his mind, are more like Mozart in the sense that every detail of his work is completely notated to have full control over the music and even how it is played. And that would be similar to JavaScript or WebAssembly programmers who need to take control over what the browser does. I mean, this is highly priced skill, one that I will never have, and needed because you can't have shopping carts out there that randomly ad lib prices. Declarative programmers are more like Miles Davis in that he will give his musicians a few parameters like tempo, general feel, and key, and let the musicians to respond to each other and their audience. And this is more like doing intrinsic declarative UX design. We have to accept that there are too many unknown device types and preferences. A user can just bloat out their font size if they want and destroy our designs if we're too fixed in these things. So just too many changes and variables to control the UX side of it. So to use Jen Simmons' term, we're really trying to program a flexibility model, or my favorite is actually comes from Andy Bell, which he uses in a talk, which is become the browser's mentor, not its micromanager. Anyway, I think I've gone on for long enough, so I'm going to leave it there. Hopefully this wasn't too patronizing. I'm well aware there's plenty of freelancers who are totally on board with the concept of intrinsic web design and talk in these terms. To me, it's still relatively new because previously I've got most of my news from the WordPress community, which is disconnected from the W3C, and particularly more so since Gutenberg and the new focus on competing with the likes of Wix and Squarespace. I mean, I did follow YouTubers, and many are brilliant and certainly would wipe the floor with me when it comes to any kind of CSS coding challenge. But I did find that how-tos are a really terrible way to relearn CSS and get the right mental model. No doubt I'll create some of the same issues when I get into that, but that's why I'm trying to focus on more context and historical in this case. I'm not going to be churning out content. It'll just be as I do it. I'm not going to get controversial just to sort of milk the algorithm or endorse products from now on. I know this is not going to earn me many subscribers, so if you do like this kind of approach, then please do try and help with some likes and some comments. Next time, what I want to do is to get a little bit more into the code that we have with modern CSS. But I'm aware that this gets overwhelming. It overwhelms me if we start to get into the details and the specifications, particularly as people are experimenting with putting together different parts of it. What I'd like to do more is to look at some ways of approaching it, ways of looking at it, mental models, so we can avoid getting into some of the false dichotomies we get out there. Things like, should you go mobile first or desktop first? That they're actually kind of false if we look at it in the right way. Anyway, I hope this was useful, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks so much for your time. Bye-bye.